Fanboyism. Where did it all start? Where did it all come from? Well, I will take you on that journey and I will explain why fanboyism is the way it is today, divided in three different sides. So let's dive into the history of fanboyism. Well, let's go back to 1986, release of a Commodore 64. Granted, before Commodore 64 there was Spectrum ZX, but the only reason I'm not showing Spectrum ZX is because it's irrelevant, because Spectrum ZX was just a computer that had some games on it, but it was mainly for used as a computer workforce trying to do different multitasking on it and do different programs and whatnot. It was used by programmers, early programmers. We're talking 1984, something like that. But this is where it truly kind of started the whole injection. Yes, there was Atari. There were handheld little gaming devices. But this is where it truly kind of kicked in the gear, shifting in the gear. What Commodore did, this company in United Kingdom, what they've done is they injected this first embryo that is going to grow into this big avalanche of fanboyism, which if you guys follow what I'm saying here on this video and connect the dots, you will understand what I'm talking about. Remember, we're going on a journey. We're 1986. Here goes the Commodore. Commodore 64 was a device that has a cassette player. Commodore was mainly advertised as a your personal computer / gaming, and also it was used as something that kids in high school and college would use. It was also something that back then 128-bit and 64-bit. It was something that was on the rise, and it was considered like highly technically advanced computer back then. But it was mainly used for the gaming. Let's face it, it was mainly for the gaming, and it had a lot of games. It had a lot of games. It had a lot of games, but it also had a lot of issues as well. Like you would have this 64K RAM system back then, and sometimes you would have to use a cassette. Actually, you have to use a cassette player. Later on, the floppy disk came in on Amiga 500, which I will show, but on the 64K RAM system, there was a cassette player, and you would have to adjust that cassette player in order for you to read the data that's being uploaded and loaded into your computer system. That's how you would play a game. It was stored in a cassette tape, and the cassette tape would read that game data into the computer. Now, this is the version that used the floppy disk, and there's also the version that used a cassette, which I will show it to you. Yes, that's actually what it was. It was a cassette player, and you put a tape in it, and then you go ahead and you read the game that's stored on there, and then if the head wasn't dirty, if head was clean, that it would read it properly, and then you would be able to transfer that data into a computer, and then computer would upload that data. It would say system ready. And pretty much this is what you would end up with, is this 64K RAM system ready. But now enough about me explaining you the technical details about this. But the only reason I'm showing you this is because this is where it all kind of started. Mine's 64K, yours is 128K. Oh my God, you have a Amiga 500. Now, please keep in mind, Amiga was also designed by the same company, Commodore 64. The difference with Amiga 500 was it was much more powerful than Commodore 64. And with Amiga 500, you had floppy disk option. And if you guys don't know what the floppy disk is, well, let me show it to you. And this is pretty much what the floppy disk looked like on the Amiga 500. Obviously, there was many different variations of the floppy disks, but the one that the Amiga 500 was using was the one right here. That's blue. That was the one that they were using back then. And there it is. There's the floppy disk drive. That's where it goes in. And that was the Commodore 64 with Amiga 500. Now, the reason I mentioned both of these consoles, it's because both of these consoles were created by the same company, but yet still you can feel it. You can sense the rise of the argument of fanboyism. Granted, Amiga 500 was better, was more powerful than the Commodore 64, but Commodore 64 still had a lot of cool, great games that Amiga 500 didn't have. And that's where this whole argument versus came in of divide. Commodore 64, I like it, it has more games. Amiga 500 has a floppy disk, reads faster, runs faster. And I think that's where the injection of fanboyism started. And that's why I'm showing you this, because it's the injection of the fanboyism that started growing that embryo. But it's 1987, and, well, hold on a second. I believe Japan smelled the opportunity. And what do we talk about here? What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about one and only. And of course, we're talking about Super Nintendo, SNES. You know, once Nintendo came in on the scene, a lot of their creative characters, including Super Mario, came in and started taking off. Mario was pretty hot back then. Pretty hot. And a lot of kids, a lot of even adults were playing with their families. They were playing Super Mario, and a bunch of other characters that came in on the scene. So Donkey Kong, the list goes on and on. And this is where Nintendo truly started creating a huge fan base. With Nintendo rise and huge fan base, it was pretty much a sealed deal. Sure, we had Atari, but Atari honestly couldn't really compete against Super Nintendo. Sure, they had some games like Defender and that E.T. game, which nobody played. Nobody played E.T. I played it. I liked it. And the rise of Nintendo truly wiped out both Commodore and Amiga 500. The reason being it wiped them off because Commodore 64 and Amiga, they both realized that it's going to be impossible for them to compete with Nintendo console. And plus, Nintendo was a bit cheaper than Commodore and Amiga 500. So Commodore, I don't know their story, how they quit and how they went out of business, but I just know that they couldn't compete with gaming, which was Nintendo. And Nintendo was the king of the freaking hill back then. And it was rising and rising and rising. Till Sega Genesis came on a rise. Now, Sega Genesis has their own universe and their own characters, and they did okay. I mean, they did okay. But still, they couldn't compete with what was a huge fan base of Nintendo. The reason I'm showing these different consoles and different, if you will, going down a memory lane, introductions, journey of history of all of this, it's because I want you to understand how this whole fanboyism grew into and where it all came from. Because a lot of you would like to know how did this whole thing started? That's what I'm trying to do here. Now, sure, Genesis, it's something Sega tried to compete with Nintendo, and they did okay, but still they couldn't compete with the Nintendo at that time. And now here comes Nintendo 64, and this is where truly things started getting a bit interesting. Nintendo 64 success with their cartridges and their unique games like Zelda, GoldenEye, Donkey Kong, Turok. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. They were truly dominating gaming. Well, Sega wanted to come back again and wanted to introduce something new to Nintendo 64. Their answer to their new console was Sega Saturn. Sega Saturn was their new introduction into the compact disc. And sure, granted, they had some games, usual the Sonic ones and some other characters. Uh, they had their console, and the problem with Sega Saturn was the fact that it was a new technology, compact disc, and you know their console was much more expensive than Nintendo 64, and they did okay, but they couldn't compete. They didn't last too long, and of course, Nintendo 64 was still the king of the jungle. But here comes another competitor. Well, you guessed it, Sony PlayStation. Now, this is a Sony's joining in into the whole fanboyism fight. And this is where truly things started shifting into a whole other gear. We went from first and second to the third and fourth gear. Now we're in a third gear, moving slowly to the fourth gear. This is where truly two competitors now going eye to eye, sword to sword, uh, mano a mano. They're going directly at each other. And both of these consoles are very successful. Both of these brands are very successful, and they're both from Japan, and now they're the true competitors to each other. Sega couldn't stay in the fight, so now we have PlayStation, we have Sony, and Nintendo battling it out. Now you have this two divides. You have Sony and Nintendo. Two divides. The red versus blue. Now the success of Sony PlayStation, it's obviously it's exclusive games that they have. You have a Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, Parasite Eve, Siphon Filter. The list goes on and on and on. Ratchet and Clank, right? It's very successful console from Sony. Now, granted, Sony did good. Nintendo 64 did good as well. They were both going at each other's throat. Both of these consoles going head to head. One was using a very successful compact disc, and the other one was using a cartridge. And the cartridges in Nintendo 64 sometimes they would get dusty and they wouldn't work. While the same thing could be said for this compact disc on Sony, it would get scratched up and it wouldn't work. But both of these consoles are very successful. Nintendo tried to come back, with their answer by implementing some kind of an adapter for a compact disc, but it never happened. And now here we got Sega coming back into the action. Sega Dreamcast came back in the action in 1999, and it was more powerful than PlayStation and Nintendo 64. It had much better memory card. It had more ports. It was a very unique console because it has a lot of exclusives. Like Crazy Taxi was the one I start thinking of. NFL 2K, There were so many games, 2K Sports, NBA 2K Sports, NFL 2K Sports. There were so many games that came on Shenmue 2. There were so many games that came out for this Sega Dreamcast. I would say this is one of their most successful consoles they ever built. And sadly, Sega Dreamcast felt that there was a monster coming on the horizon, and they weren't kidding. Sega Dreamcast saw this monster coming, and the monster I'm talking about now is PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2 was the monster that came over the hill in 2000 and pretty much destroyed Dreamcast. Dreamcast was totally out of the game. They withdraw, and there was only two competitors now. You had Nintendo and Sony. Now Sony was the king of the hill. Sony was the most selling, highest console, PlayStation 2, both PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, and especially PlayStation 2 because it had the DVD drive in there. That was a selling point, and also had a much faster chip built into it. And the amount of games that came out for this console was just remarkable. So now Sony is taking the lead in fanboyism. Now there's a huge rise of even some Nintendo fanboys actually switched to PlayStation 2. That's how successful this console was. So this is where there's two sides of fanboyism. Now you had Nintendo trying to come up with some of their new ideas, and of course their new ideas was a GameCube, but GameCube was nothing. GameCube was really nothing to write home about because it had some games. It has a little mini discs inside, but it was nowhere near powerful as PlayStation 2, and there was just so more and more games were being made for PlayStation 2. All of the third parties went to a PlayStation 2. So Sony was still leading, right? Until somebody else came on the scene. Some guy that created the Windows. He decided, why don't I join in into this fanboyism movement? And of course, we're talking about Xbox One. Excuse me, Xbox 2001, the original Xbox, by Bill Gates being presented here. And with a big gigantic controller and a big gigantic box, it was advertised as the most powerful console. And now you have third fanboy spot to be opened for new groups of fanboys, and this is coming now for the Xbox. And of course, the fanboyism started with one other than Halo. Halo Combat Evolved was the game that truly pushed this console. And it did, the Xbox, original Xbox in 2001 November, truly sold really well because of Project Gotham Racing, but mainly because of Halo Combat Evolved. The Halo Combat Evolved, the ability to play on a LAN, to play with split screen up to, you can connect bunch of TVs together and play split screen with a LAN party, local LAN party, and Halo Combat Evolved truly started the new rise of fanboyism, and that's where it truly started. Thanks to this man. Yes, thank you, Bill Gates. You made a third spot for fanboys to rise. And of course, later on, we had Xbox 360, Wii from Nintendo. That was also very, very successful. PlayStation 3 came out in 2006, I believe. That was kind of successful, but it didn't sell out when it came out, but later on started selling out pretty good when they started releasing more and more games. And then after that, you got PlayStation 4, Wii U, and of course, the Xbox One. And of course, now we also have Xbox One S and PlayStation 4 Pro. But let's get back to the fanboyism. Now we have three layers, three groups of fanboyism. There they are: blue, green, and red. Almost like a flag, isn't it? When I start to think of it, it is almost like a flag: red, blue, and green, or blue, red, and green, or green, red, and blue. Each which way you want to take it, there it is. So anyway, blue for PlayStation, red for Nintendo, and green for Xbox, Microsoft. So here's the question that I'm going to leave this video with a question for you guys about fanboyism. And I want you guys to leave a comment down below and give me your answer. Here's the question. The question is this: since I just spent 20 minutes on this journey walking you through all the way back from 1986 to present time, I pretty much showed you how the influence of other brands, of other consoles, have created this rise of fanboys or fanboyism for the brand, for the love of the brand and love of the product. Now, there's nothing wrong with loving a product. I have no issue with that. But the problem with, to me, with the fanboyism is why would you, here's the question. This is the question I want to leave it for you guys. Why would you only limit yourself to one brand and one brand only? Why not experience all three? Why limit yourself to one brand? Why wouldn't you want to experience PlayStation 4 and their exclusives and their VR? Why wouldn't you want to experience Xbox One S and 4K UHD player and their exclusives? Or Nintendo, why wouldn't you want to experience Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and their characters and their universe? Why limit yourself to one brand? That is my question to you guys. And I'm going to leave this video like this. So that's my question for you fanboys out there. Or should I also say for you, Ron John, why would you limit yourself to one brand only? All right, so that's the question. Thank you for watching.